The heat. Historians say President Eisenhower's speech in 1961 about the military-industrial complex was prophetic. The United States spends more on its military than any other country and ranks #1 in global arms exports. We continue our conversation now with the senior U.S. diplomat, former U.S. ambassador to Morocco, Mark Ginsburg from New York. We're joined by author and commentator Peter Van Buren, and with us here in the studio in Washington, D.C. is retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Karen Kretkowski. Let me get to that question, Ambassador. The United States is involved in all these battles around the world. There are accusations that it is the world's policeman. Has it policed anything, as Karen asked?
Oh, absolutely. I don't particularly. You know, there's always areas of agreement and disagreement with respect on these issues. I mean, after all, look at the situation in Bosnia and Kosovo. The United States had an essential role. Europe did not step up to the plate. People were being massacred. Okay, the United States provided the type of leadership that Europe perhaps should have provided. There was an effective police operation. Whether or not we should have been the policeman remains to be seen. In the Ebola crisis, we were in effect the health policeman that came to the rescue of those countries that were desperate in this situation. The fact of the matter is the president's #1 responsibility to the American people is to defend the homeland. Invading Iraq is not my definition of protecting the homeland. What is essential, however, as you pointed out, is this global war of terrorism that has been stoked. Now, you can argue whether ISIS is a direct threat to the United States or not. I tend to argue that right now it's not a direct threat. However, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is now in effect seizing more control in Yemen, is a huge direct threat to the United States. And the fact of the matter is that if America is attacked and the United States has not had an effective counterterrorism policy in Yemen right now, the president and the administration are going to be held accountable for not doing its job.
Peter, what do you make of that? The United States has played a role in the wars that took place in what was the former Yugoslavia. It has played a role in the Ebola crisis in West Africa.
Well, certainly Yugoslavia stands out. It's important to recognize that that was 20-some years ago. And it's important to recognize that it's very difficult to find too many other examples where American military intervention has done that type of work. Ebola is, of course, very different. The United States did end up using some military resources to do that, but that's simply because the military has airplanes and doctors who can set up hospitals in the field, and FEMA does and the Red Cross does, but the military is good at that type of thing. And that's, I think, a very different thing. There were no bombs, there were no guns, there were no cruise missile attacks there. I don't think that fits in this definition. But I think what is important is to not look at only the single trumpeted success of the last 20 years, but to look at the number of unfortunate, tragic failures. ISIS grew out of America's failures in Iraq. ISIS has profited, and initial successes in Iraq were all based on the chaos that the United States created and then left in Iraq. What's happening in Yemen today is writ large America's failure as a policeman. For the last how many years, the United States has conducted drone strikes, special forces raids, has poured hundreds of millions of dollars of weapons into the hands of Yemen's former government, and has wrought what? Right now, what we have going on in Yemen is something very akin to a civil war, an ungoverned space, a chaotic space where one side is receiving its weapons and owes its allegiance to the Iranians. The other side is, as the ambassador pointed out, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula finding another ungoverned space to make themselves at home in. The United States' policy failures as a policeman go right back to the issues that I believe showed in your video. We need a bigger toolbox. Right now, it seems that the only thing the United States ever reaches for is the hammer, the weapons, the military options. We have a foreign service. We have parts of the intelligence service that aren't involved in shooting things and blowing things up. The successes that the United States has enjoyed over its 200-some years have depended in large part on choosing the right tool for the right job, of having a large toolbox. Right. I think if there was a way to say what we've lost since 9/11, it's the willingness to use all those tools.
Karen, talking about toolboxes, and we talk about another aspect of the proliferation of arms, and that's the arms exports from the United States to the rest of the world. To what extent has that become a tool of U.S. foreign policy? The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, pretty respected institute, says that the U.S. leads the world as the top arms exporter.
Well, we do, and we subsidize the other countries' purchase of those arms. So, I mean, in some ways, it's really closely aligned with our domestic market. If U.S. taxpayers are subsidizing the loans or giving the aid, and the aid includes the purchase back of American weapons, it again feeds the machine at home. It has very little to do with stability. It has very little to do with security of those other countries. It to some extent, has to do with propping up regimes that we like the Saudis, but that's not an effective long-term policy. And so, as far as the toolbox goes, it's still limited. We're still stuck on marketing our stuff that we produce to kill people.
Ambassador, you've been right there at the coalface, involved in these negotiations that take place. Is there a connection between U.S. foreign policy and arms exports?
Yes, there is, and you can't disassociate it. The fact of the matter is that most of the governments that are not what I would call our democratic allies are dependent on receiving arms. And there's always this, in effect, a arms race between whether or not, for example, Russia's Putin is able to get a foothold in a country that we have an interest in by subsidizing arms exports. It becomes, in effect, the very issue that all of us have expressed one way or the other here, a concern that arms exports almost become a tool of foreign policy because we're so deeply concerned about what the other guy may buy from an adversary.
And you mentioned the Middle East. 71% of arms exports go to one part of the world, the Gulf.
Yes, and in effect, look at the oil revenue that is used to fuel the massive amount of arms acquisitions, the top-of-the-line Air Force acquisitions, the top-of-the-line weaponry. Listen, from Qatar to the United Arab Emirates to Kuwait to Saudi Arabia, there's no doubt that if it hadn't been for the oil revenue and the amount of money that these countries want to spend on arms, there wouldn't be the market there.
So the money's actually doing a round trip, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Peter, I want to get to something. Time's catching up with us. But the war on terror, has spawned this entire new complex, which is now being called the military-industrial homeland security complex, where computers and cameras and drones are being used as weapons. And then we add to that, of course, the increasing militarization of local police forces, domestic police forces in the United States. I mean, how big has this U.S. war machine become right now?
Well, that is, in fact, one of the most critical issues. And referring back to the ambassador saying that the president's job is to protect the homeland, one has to start to ask the questions about protect us from whom? We have seen as these weapons of war have come back into the United States and been distributed to police departments. We see things like we saw in Ferguson, Missouri. We see things like we have here in New York City, where there's rarely a place that you're not under some form of surveillance. And following up on Karen's remarks, we have created a self-licking ice cream cone where we have created a second domestic market. Not only is our military purchasing these weapons and creating an industry that serves only them, but now there's the homeland security side of it. And so we get body scanners that don't really work at our airports. We get small-town police departments that have armored vehicles and drones and surveillance equipment that they really don't need. And so we're just simply treating our own country like another export market. We might as well open an embassy with an office of foreign military sales, like the ambassador and I knew in many of our embassies, and start selling them to Fargo and Ferguson and Los Angeles.
Karen, there have been cuts in the military budget, or possibly cuts in the growth of the military budget. And that's prompted some of the top brass in the military to warn that the United States may not be ready for the next crisis. We heard General Raymond Odierno, very senior member in the Pentagon, say that we are mortgaging our modernization, we are mortgaging our readiness.
Yeah, well, we weren't ready for the last crisis and the last attack, okay? We're not ready to defend this country, and nothing that we spend our money on so-called defensively by the Pentagon does anything to defend our country or the people that live here. So that's a real problem.
Ambassador, will we ever get to the point where the Pentagon will say to us, we've got enough, thanks?
I'm afraid that as long as Congress and the Pentagon have a mutual interest to a certain extent in furthering the job security of the industrial complex that has been the subject of this conversation, it's going to be doubtful. It's going to take real leadership and, in effect, a pivot, as my colleague in New York rightfully says, a pivot away from what essentially has been an industrial complex and focus more on the diplomacy that I fully agree with. We have to be more forwardly engaged in our diplomacy. Perhaps that will cut back the need for this military-industrial complex.
Because ultimately what we're saying here, if the country is perpetually at war, is that diplomacy has failed.
Well, agreed, and that's why, in some respects, as a former diplomat, I want to see our toolbox expanded.
Okay.